It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Alister McGrath. I'll give you the formal introduction first. So Alister McGrath is the Andreas Ickios Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University and Director of the Ian Ransom Centre for Science and Religion. After studying chemistry as an undergraduate at Oxford, Alister McGrath gained a doctorate in molecular biophysics under the supervision of Professor Sir George Bouverie. After a period specialising in historical and systematic theology, he began to explore the relation of science and faith in detail. As a former atheist, McGrath is especially interested in the role that the natural sciences have played in the apologetics of the new atheism. He is the author of many books. I'll stop there because that's an understatement. I googled his latest books this afternoon. In fact, there's an entire Google search term called McGrath books. So just take a look against the day-to-day update on his production. Many of these books, by the way, have become standard textbooks for our students. Introduction to Historical Theology, Introduction to Christian Theology. But in recent years, his interest has been digging the work of C.S. Lewis. He's written an award-winning biography of C.S. Lewis. And in his research fields, there's a particular focus on natural theology. He directed a major research project in natural theology several years ago, funded by the Templeton Foundation, and this was natural theology was the theme of his 2009 Gifford Lectures. So it's very good that we managed to get him here today. He's got to dash off to give another lecture at 7:30. So my job is to cut him short and get him out the door not later than a minute or two after 7:10. So you should speak for about 40 minutes, and hopefully a bit of time for Q&A afterwards. So would you please welcome Professor Alister McGrath, who will talk on science and faith, knowing nature and knowing God.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you here in this wonderful chapel, which brings back very, very happy memories for me. When I got to Oxford in 1971, I was a very aggressive atheist. In fact, when I read Richard Dawkins these days, I get all nostalgic, because actually that's the way I used to be as well. And I discovered Christianity while I was here at Oxford. And I think one of the things that really helped me grow in my faith was actually Pusey House. I came here to chapel regularly on Sundays, and there were 4 of us from Wadham who came, as one of them president of the congregation, Michael mentioned. I found it enriched my mind. It gave me this very strong sense that Christianity made sense. That actually, in becoming a Christian, you didn't have to compartmentalize your mind. There was this sort of faith stuff, and then there was the real world. And I think Pusey House really helped me make that transition. And of course, I remember this chaplain's worship. I remember also Cheslin Jones, who was the principal at that stage. She was actually very helpful to me in many ways, and actually he married me and my wife in Merton Chapel many years ago. He made it very clear he didn't go into this kind of thing himself, but he was very happy to marry us. So let's move on and look at our theme. And our theme basically is this whole vista of the relation of science and theology. But I want to approach it, if I may, from the theme of this conference, trying to ask in what way a Trinitarian vision of reality might actually do something to enrich our faith. I want to begin with a quote from F.J. Hort. Perhaps an unusual choice, but this was Halcyon Lectures, where he's talking about how an enriched vision of nature enriches also your vision of God. One of the points that Hort is making is that, look, once you really appreciate nature all the more, once you appreciate humanity all the more, the depths of those insights cannot help but enrich your admiration for God, your understanding of God, your longing to know more about God. And that seems to me to be a very important point. It reminds me of that line in the Confessions where Augustine says, why are you going to look at the sea, the mountain, everything, when you can look at yourselves, trying to make the point that actually human nature is well worth reflecting on. But I thought in opening this lecture here in Pusey House Chapel, I think John Henry Newman might be a very good starting point for my lecture. And what I want to do is to invite you to look at the trajectory of thought that lies behind this quote, which comes from a letter he wrote. I believe in design because I believe in God, not in God because I see design. Newman clearly has someone in his guns it's William Paley, but here what Newman is saying is that you cannot look at nature and see design. You can infer design, you can't see it. And anyway, what you are doing is you are looking at the natural world through a lens, through a framework that's provided by the Christian faith, and as a result of that, this resonates, this chimes in, this makes so much sense. And in many ways, that's the fundamental theme of the lecture I want to give tonight. It's that Christianity gives us this template, this framework, this way of looking at reality, which actually enables us to see science and faith in a very helpful, and I want to suggest enriching way. In other words, it's not really about nature forcing us to believe in God. It's much more believing in God for other reasons, and then bringing this faith to looking at nature and discovering the enrichment, the added depth that this brings to our reflections. And Newman's point, I think, is that he's really bringing out the resonance between a theory and observation. In other words, you're asking how well does a theory position or enable us to make sense of what we observe? How well, therefore, does Christianity allow us to see the natural world? What we observe of nature, or indeed what we might experience within ourselves. Andrew mentioned I've written about C.S. Lewis, and those of you who know Lewis will know how important this was to Lewis, particularly in the late 20s, early 30s, as Lewis began to realise that atheism might make some sort of sense, but it wasn't actually generative, it didn't stimulate the imagination. And if Christianity was right, it gave you this imaginatively engaged way of looking at the world, which actually seemed to make so much sense of the world outside and the world within. And two themes I want to talk about particularly tonight are the themes of intelligibility and coherence. They're not the same, but they do, I think, open up some very important frameworks for us to discuss. In other words, the fact that we can make sense of nature, which I think is very, very important, at limited amount of sense, but nevertheless this fundamental feeling that we are able to actually begin to get a handle on something that's deeper than us, and also to realize it's not a series of disconnected episodes, that there might be some big picture which really enables us to hold this whole thing together. And one of the themes I'll develop in this lecture is that Trinitarian vision of reality actually gives you this way of looking at things. If you like, a lens that brings things into focus so you can see the detail. But more than that, a way of reassuring yourself that there is a half-grasped, but nevertheless real vision of a coherent reality lying behind that. And that word coherence, I think, is very important. Because in our culture, there's this pressure towards fragmentation. Maybe there is this localized theory which does something for this part of reality, a different localized theory for that part, but there is no big picture, no meta-narrative, just, in effect, lots of little pictures, little narratives. And at least as I see it, Christianity gives us this big picture which talks about coherence. If you want to pick up on a biblical theme, you might think of Colossians 1, which talks about all things being joined together, all things cohering in Christ. It's a very powerful theme, and it seems to me that really is part of the vision of reality that we are trying to articulate. And of course, this idea of coherence, I think, is best imaginatively grasped rather than rationally discerned. And you might like to imagine that you're on a mountaintop looking down at a beautiful vista, and you see rivers, villages, houses, animals, and you take snapshots of each of these. And then someone else with a much better camera than you takes a panoramic shot. And the thing about a panoramic shot is that all the snapshots fit in, and you're able to see they're part of the same picture, but it's a bigger picture. And in many ways, that's the motif of this lecture, that Christianity does give us this big picture, which helps us to make sense of reality. This is not a new idea, and this is, of course, George G.K. Chesterton, who, of course, in many ways, is a primary example of someone who discovered this for himself. Many of you will know this article, the return of the angels, in which Chesterton talked about his return to belief. And he returned to his belief because basically he came to the realization that the Christian meta-narrative, the Christian way of looking at things, made so much more sense than its alternatives. And he tried to explain what he found in it. Numbers of us have returned to this belief, and we've returned to it not because of this argument or that argument, but because the theory, when it's adopted, works out everywhere. In other words, not this little thing, but rather the big picture, the overall thing. It's not individual arguments, it's not individual instances that do the job. It's the fact that there is something bigger than this, which does the job so much more effectively. Because the coat, when it's tried on, fits in every crease. I think I would query the word every, but we'll leave that. We put on the theory like a magic hat, and history becomes translucent like a house of glass. In other words, this theoretical way of seeing things, enables you to discern things which otherwise you don't, including the fact they belong together. And in that article, there's that beautiful line, which I think is so helpful. The phenomenon doesn't prove religion, but religion explains the phenomenon. In other words, we're not looking at some rather crude way of saying, we observe this, therefore there is a God. It's much more that if there is a God, and if this God is the kind of God that Christians adore and worship, then this makes sense. And really that's the motif of Chesterton's approach. And a rather nice way of expressing it, this idea once inside our heads, a million things become transparent, as if a lamp were lit behind them. And that seems to me to be a helpful way of beginning to think about how we might frame a Christian understanding of the relationship of science and faith. I emphasize the word Christian, because there are so many ways of looking at this. They're all views from some specific location. But I want to, in effect, stand within the Christian tradition and ask what way of seeing things does this make possible? And in many ways, we're picking up on a theme from C.S. Lewis, as one of Lewis's best-known quotations, comes from the end of his lecture, is theology poetry. And it's a very powerful visual image, many of you will know it very well. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And it's a very powerful image. First of all, it invites us to visualize the sun rising on a dark landscape, and as the sun rises, the shadows begin to go, and the mist begins to burn off. You see more clearly, more further than you otherwise would, even though shadows and mist still remain. And one of the points that Lewis is making is, it's a bit like using your mind. You judge you have a mind by the fact that you're able to make so much sense of things. And Lewis is almost saying that the intellectual habitation of Christianity actually is almost self-validating in the sense that it in effect gives you this way of looking at things which makes so much sense. So I'm going to talk a bit about this word metanoia. And of course, as you all know, we translate this as repentance, but maybe it's not that good a translation. Those of you who enjoy reading Tertullian will know the moans about this from time to time. I personally think it means something much more like a fundamental shift in mental outlook, or perhaps a change in the mental map we use to make sense of and act within our world. I don't want to build too much on my own experience, but moving from an atheist perspective, which I knew and understood very well, to a Christian perspective was actually quite challenging, because there was so much rearranging of mental furniture that had to be done. But nevertheless, this describes very well what happened. The sense that I used to look at things through this lens, through this mental framework. Now I'm looking at things through this mental framework. And obviously there is this whole question of how that transition happens, the extent to which the old way of thinking persists into the new, and so on. But nevertheless, it is, I think, very important. It's a reminder there is something distinctive about what the Christian faith has to say and offer, and an invitation to explore and discover it. And so in many ways in this lecture, what I want to do is to explore in which engaging the world of nature from a Trinitarian perspective offers us insights that we might otherwise miss. And what I want to do is to begin by emphasizing that we cannot ignore the role of ourselves as observers. That there is this whole question of the role of biblical imagery picked up and developed by so many theologians like Alister, of eyes that don't really work very well. They need to be healed. Or indeed veils being removed or scales falling from our eyes. So that in effect we are able to see, not just look at, but see. And it's a very important point. Because in many ways it's beginning to open up this whole question of the manner in which our sight is healed and who is doing it. And perhaps bringing it home to us that this is not something we can perhaps achieve unaided, but rather it's an operation of divine grace. And that seems to me to open up some very important themes. Also, of course, it offers us a very rich ontology, which is not simply about making more sense of nature, but also the human engagement with nature. Now, there are many ways which we might think about this, but one of the points I think that does need to be made here is that in many ways the natural sciences, which began in the early modern period, very often work with an idea of God which you and I might loosely describe as deistic. Here is a God who created things, that's quite enough, but it's good enough to get on with, and you draw certain conclusions as a result. But it is an observer God, not a participant God. It's a God who has delegated autonomy, a God who has stood back. And of course, this makes some sense of things, but you can't help but feel that something is very seriously missing from this picture. And of course, in the early modern period, the rise of rationalism, there was intense suspicion of the idea of the Trinity. I think it was Tillotson who, I think, tried to show why the doctrine of the Trinity, A, was necessary and B, useful, and actually struggled on both counts. But we have to bear in mind, I think, that the rationalist culture of that time, in many ways, distanced people from the idea of the Trinity. And I think the recovery of that in the 20th century really is enormously important. It opens up new ways of thinking about divine action in nature. It opens up new intellectual possibilities, which I think are very interesting and important. And one of the points I want to make is we talk about a natural theology. I'll come back to that later. It illuminates both the process of engaging with nature and the outcome of that engagement. One of the points that many scientists make, which I think is very relevant to this conversation, is that they don't really feel they know what to do with the beauty of nature. The ordering of nature, that's one thing, but the beauty of nature seems redundant, superfluous. And I think one of the things that really excites me about a Christian way of looking at this is the whole idea that appreciating the beauty of nature actually reflects back on the greater beauty of God. In other words, Christianity gives you an intellectual framework which not simply heightens your attentiveness to Simon Weil or Aristotle's way of thinking and generates an expectation that there is something there to be found, but also calls you to focus your attention on it when you do find it. I think the whole vision of the Trinity is one which creates an expectation that in our engagement with the natural world, we will find things which are not simply interesting, but also enrich and deepen our vision of God. And that intellectual trajectory seems to me to be very important. It also, I think, opens up a question which many of us reflect on, which is the question of whether science has limits. In other words, are there certain questions that science simply isn't able to engage or answer? And this is also Taylor, there are many others who make a very, very simple point. But the basic point that's being made here is, I think, important. One of the paradoxes of science is this. We know from massive psychological research how very important human beings find questions of meaning and value. And yet science itself cannot answer those questions of meaning and value. In other words, like empirical observation confirms how important these things are to people. It's about being human. These things just happen. But science itself doesn't answer those questions. I will tell you what criteria you might use something to be meaningful, but what that meaning is remains opaque. And we'll take it here, it's picking up on this idea of finding Karl Popper of ultimate questions, and just saying, in effect, look, isn't science wonderful? But there's a price, and that is there are certain questions it can't answer. Scientific truth is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions. But science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. And I find that helpful. It seems to me to summarize very well what the issues are. Science, if I put it very simply, fills in part of a bigger picture. But there are other parts there that are left blank. And the question is whether we have to leave them blank or whether we fill them in using other sources. And I want to come back to this later in this lecture as I begin to map out possible strategies for doing it. But it does seem to me it's very important. If you treat every question in life as a scientific question, you will get a scientific answer. And very often that answer is going to be there isn't an answer to that question, which leads some to conclude there are no answers. But I think others would say, therefore, we look somewhere else to find good answers to those questions. And I will take us in making the point we can't get away from these questions. They bubble up within us all the time. Scientific truth may be exact, but it is incomplete. And that seems to me to be a very important point to make, that if you like, the human epistemic condition is that we recognize the importance of certain questions, and yet we struggle to find answers. And hence, in effect, are in this dilemma whereby we know certain things are very important. We cannot actually find the absolutely certain and clear answers that the Enlightenment hoped to find. And in many ways, I think our dilemma is simpler, that whether we are atheists or religious or simply social beings, we in effect have to live trusting certain things to be right, but not being able to show that they are. And very often, as Ortega makes clear, these are very important things, these ultimate questions. I talked about coherence earlier, and this is a line from John Donne, many of you will know it, is all the pieces, all coherence gone. And Donne is writing, I think it's 1611 in this case, and he's worried about at least two things. One of them is the rise of radical philosophies, which call into question the ideas of meaning and certainly the ideas of coherence. But he's also concerned about the rise of science and the feeling which was present, not everywhere, but in enough places to make it noticeable, that science actually was eroding the medieval view of there being an arche, a big picture of some sort. And Donne was wondering how on earth you put this thing back together. I don't think he answers the question, but it is, I think, a very good question to answer. Alice Murdoch, in Metaphysics and Book of Metaphysics and Morals, talks about the way in which we seek for something that is whole, W-H-O-L-E, something that brings mental calm. She's trying to argue, in effect, that when we sense we've seen how the dots connect up, that actually that makes it easier for us to live. And that does seem to be a very important point to make. My figure of Edward Bouverie poem on, being bombarded with like meteorites, disconnected facts and observations, and she's looking for some way of weaving these together. Can these threads be woven together to disclose a pattern? And she's wondering if there's a loom that makes sense of these threads. And Donne is getting at this. And it seems to me that while we do want to be cautious about the idea that Christianity offers explanation, nonetheless, that seems to me to be part of what it does. Not all it does, but nevertheless it's able to give us this way of looking at things, which actually reassures us that there is interconnection, that there is some way of making sense of this. And that seems to me to be one of the things we do need to hold on to. And again, you might think of the way in which the doctrine of the Trinity can perhaps be expanded to avoid the compartmentalization of God. God is there in the beauty of a sunset, but he's not there in suffering, and he's certainly not there in the everyday business of the world. And trying to realize that at least as a project, Trinitarianism offers us a way of beginning to see God in unexpected places. Others will say more about that, I'm sure. But this is Peter Medawar, one of my favourite biologists. He was very much the Richard Dawkins of the 1950s. And Medawar, as a scientific popularizer, was trying to wrestle with the question of what is distinctive about human beings. And this is one of the answers he comes up with, which I think is quite interesting. Only humans find their way by a light that illuminates more than the patch of ground they stand on. And that seems to me to highlight something that is important. It's not a question of surviving, getting by from one day to the next. It's wanting to make sense of our situation. There may be an unintended resonance there with John Henry Newman's The Kind of Light. But the point I'm making is that Medawar is saying this seems to be the way we are as human beings. And so the question therefore is, what do we do in our apologetics, in our preaching, in our pedagogic work, to try and maximize the realization that this is something that our faith can do? Because I sense that very often we're not so good at the public demonstration of the capacity of Christianity to make sense of things, to articulate a moral vision, and so on. That seems to me just something we need to keep on thinking about. So how might we begin to hold science and faith together? There are many ways. Tonight, I just look very briefly at two as a way of opening up the conversation. One way, of course, is to say that science and theology offer different perspectives on reality. And that seems to me to be a very sensible way ahead. The other, of course, is to say they offer different levels of explanation of reality. When I arrived at Oxford, as I was saying, I was an atheist. I was studying chemistry. I was an undergraduate at Wharton College. And when I switched from atheism to Christianity, I faced this challenge, which was, well, I've discovered Christianity, but I still love science. How on earth do these two relate to each other? Do I have to compartmentalize my mind, or do I in effect have to say it's this, and therefore it can't be that? I have to say it caused me mental discomfort during my years as an undergraduate. I think all of us need mentors, people who in effect draw near to us and help us as we think things through. And I struck a bit lucky, I think, because I was an undergraduate at Wharton, and Charles Coulson was professor of theoretical chemistry. The fellowship was attached to Wharton. Coulson was a well-known Methodist-day preacher, and he would preach in college chapel. And I do recall a sermon he preached, I think it was in 1973, on the relation of science and faith. It was quite a short sermon. And he very generously gave me 10 minutes of his time afterwards. But in that brief time, he gave me a way of looking at the relation of science and faith which worked for him. And I have to say it worked for me as well. And in many ways, the approach he adopted was this different perspectives on reality. Coulson was absolutely clear. You cannot believe in a God of the gaps, because that simply locates God in extremely diminishing and impoverishing ways. That you need to say, no, it's not in what cannot be explained, it is rather in what can be explained and realizing the explanatory capacity that belief in God brings to the scientific enterprise. And Coulson developed various models of doing this, but I'm going to introduce you tonight to the model developed by Mary Midgley, simply because it's very accessible and very easy. Midgley simply makes the point that life, reality, is complicated, and therefore you need multiple toolkits if you're going to engage it. You need to look at life from different perspectives, and those perspectives have a cumulative or summative goal in that they give you a bigger picture than otherwise might be the case. And she asks us to think of a person looking down into a large aquarium. And she writes, we can't see it as a whole from above, so we peer in at it through a number of small windows. The word peer is quite good there. We can eventually make quite a lot of sense of this habitat if we patiently put together the data from different angles. But if we insist that our own window is the only one worth looking through, we shan't get very far. And the point she's making, I think, is good and is helpful. That you can limit yourself to a single perspective and say that is it. Or you can realize that each perspective is limited and limited, and therefore the best view is the one that integrates as many perspectives as possible. That you need lots of colours in your palette if you're going to represent the complexity and elegance of nature. And so what Midgley is allowing us to talk about is science and faith giving us different perspectives on reality. They are different. There's a very different question about how you negotiate boundaries, and by the time I talk about that, but nevertheless there is at least a possibility of an enriched vision of reality from these different perspectives. So that's one way of looking at it, which I think some will find quite helpful. I'm going to move on now and talk about the perspective, the approach adopted by Frank Rhodes, a British geologist who became president of Cornell University in the 1990s. He asks us to imagine a kettle boil. And the essay which he wrote, those words, comes from 1965, so I'm afraid it's a kettle boiling on a gas ring. So you might like to visualize that. And then the question that Rhodes wants us to ask is this: why is the question kettle boiling? And of course, you can give a scientific answer very, very easily. It's all about energy conversion, energy transfer. As gas is burning, converts energy, water molecules into bubble and so on and so on, which is right. But then Rhodes said, but you know, there's another reason, which is I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. And I know it sounds trite and trivial, but actually there is a lot of wisdom in that insight. Let me try and tease out what the wisdom is. First of all, as he makes very, very clear, these are complementary and not competitive. One answer is appropriate to a particular frame of reference or another frame of reference, but there's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. In other words, the fact that gas is burning does not invalidate the explanation, I wanted a cup of tea. There are two, and here's the key point, different levels of explanation. Richard Dawkins, in some of his more popular essays, seems to suggest that there is a scientific explanation and that's it. I think most of us would say there are scientific explanations which are welcome and are part of a bigger picture. But there are other explanations as well. And we need to try and weave together as many explanatory levels as possible. And so therefore you might say that one way of beginning to hold together science and faith is to say that these operate at different levels. Now the danger is you collapse this into a rather simplistic way of thinking. Science asks how questions, religion asks why questions, which actually there's truth in that, but it is too easily overstated. But nevertheless, there is this point to be made. They are operating at different levels. And we need, I think, to have all those levels to have the richest explanation possible. And unquestionably, part of this is going to be religious. I don't want to talk about the Big Bang because I haven't time, but you might just think about that. I can make 2 points very simply in relation to that. One is, I think it just brings home to us the whole idea of provisionality and change in scientific theorizing. If we had been having this conference 100 years ago, the scientific consensus of the day would have been that the universe has always been around. And you and I know perfectly well that's changed massively since those days. So there's a need always to be aware that science, in effect, says we believe this at present for good reasons, but the evidence may change, theoretical interpretation may change. Therefore, this is the way we see things today, not necessarily the way things are. But more importantly, of course, the religious language of creation doesn't make all that much sense in an eternal universe. But of course, there's now this possibility of not integrating, I think, science, but certainly having a conversation about the relationship in relation to the Big Bang. Which brings us back to this point about the limits of science. Again, de Medler, a rationalist, didn't like religion very much, but was perfectly prepared to accept it asked some very good questions. And he makes the point there are certain questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. And this is not a criticism of science. I want to emphasize that point. It's very much saying this is the way it is. Therefore, raising the question of how scientifically unanswerable questions, which are nonetheless existentially important, might begin to find an answer. And it does seem to me that that is an area in which Christianity has much that could be said, much that has been said in the past, and maybe rather a lot more that could be said now than we are actually saying. And it does seem to me this is something we really do need to look at. There is a certain cynicism about certain answers, and that means I think we need to make sure they are heard credibly. I don't know how many of you saw that recent article by Lane Eklund, talking about the question of what is it that persuades somebody that science and faith can be held together. And they did an empirical survey, looking at the kind of things that influence people. The thing that is most effective is this. It is an individual, a scientist who is also a religious believer, who is able to integrate these ideas in their own persons, and as a result becomes a personal witness to the compatibility, even more than that, of science and faith. So I think there is an issue here of trying to find those people who might in effect be people who change cultural perceptions. And that I think is very interesting. This is William Inch, who, as many of you know, in St. Paul's Cathedral, trying to put his finger on what it is about God that makes such a big difference. And this, I think, is quite a nice answer. Rationalism, he writes, tries to find a place for God in its picture of world, but God can't be fitted into diagram. He is rather the canvas on which the picture is painted, or the frame in which it's set. In other words, God is not an object in the world. We can get away from that. Much more, God is that which lies behind the world. God is that which makes the world possible. God is the one, the person, who brings meaning and dignity to life. And Inch there, I think, is beginning to help us move towards some very interesting answers. So I need to talk about Psalm 19. You all know it very well. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. Musically, you find it in Haydn's Creation, or Bach's Cantata, Die Himmel, Zähle die Gottes. And it's a wonderful verse. What does it mean? Let me just leave it on the screen for 5 seconds and let you think about what that's all about. It seems to me to affirm, but also to defer, to tease, to raise some very interesting questions. What happens if we can't read the heavens? Do we need to tradition if we are to see this? Does our perception of the glory of God depend on having our eyes opened? And if so, how does that happen? Or to take the stage further, what if, to continue the metaphor, if this is written in a language we don't understand? One of my most traumatic moments was when I was in Tokyo, and I had some friends who came after me and said, we'll meet you at this underground station, take this train and we'll meet you at the other end. I went into this underground station and there was a wall covered with Japanese characters, which I could not read. Even if I could read them, I would not know what they meant. Happily, some very kind Japanese people noticed my bewilderment and sorted me out. But you know, what if that's the situation? You're looking at something and you just don't get it. You aren't able to make any sense of this. It seems to me to be an important question. Do we need to be helped to see the heavens declaring the glory of the Lord? Or is this something which happens naturally? I'm going to emphasize this is not a proof of God's existence. I don't think there's anything in the text that is saying, you know, look at the heavens and you'll swear there is God. It's much more a psalm that is written within the context of Israel's worship, which in effect is a community that already knows perfectly well there is a God, but rather sees looking at what God has created as a line and imaginative enhancement of our vision of a God we already know about. In other words, if you like, it's an aesthetic consolidation or crystallization of an intellectual or relational knowledge of God. And it seems to me this does raise some very interesting questions indeed. But for me, it also raises other questions, which I haven't time to look at, but let me raise them. Because A, somebody else's comments may have touched on them, and B, they are important. This psalm talks about glory. What about suffering? What about the perception of being abandoned? You can see immediately that this very rich Trinitarian lens just begins to open up some very important ways of thinking about this. Looking, for example, at the suffering of Christ as an integral way of making sense, or at least coping with something that's going on there in the universe. And again, there's a lot that could be said here, but let me just mention one example which seems to me to be particularly appropriate, and it's this. We need to draw a distinction when thinking about suffering between making sense of something and being able to cope with something. And those of you who've read the works of Kenneth Parker and others will know this is a very important theme. How do we cope with a complex reality which sometimes doesn't seem to make sense at all? And very often it is religious faith that enables people to cope with it. Going back to C.S. Lewis, you may remember Lewis wrote 2 books on suffering. The Problem of Pain, 1940, and that rather troubling book, A Grief Observed, 1961. Those of you who've read The Problem of Pain may share my discomfort, which is to say, surely this is an over-intellectualization of suffering and pain. It treats it as a kind of intellectual problem. What would happen if someone were to really experience the trauma of suffering? What would happen then? And of course we have our answer in A Grief Observed, where Lewis experienced the death of his wife and then realized the answers he gave in The Problem of Pain didn't actually work quite so well in that context. I think again this is very important. I've talked consistently about the importance of meaning in life. And meaning is not simply about being able to make sense of things. It's about being able to cope with bewilderment, uncertainty, a sense that there is a postponement of meaning. And again, I think the Christian tradition is very, very rich on this point. And we do need, I think, to move beyond the very, I think, shallow, mechanical, enlightenment type approaches to this thing, which in the past have been so influential. So it seems to me there is a lot there to look at. Now, I'm going to run out of time. I want to make a few more points before I close. If you like this approach, then I'm publishing next month a book called Reimagining Nature, The Promise of a Christian Natural Theology, and I try to pick up on some of the themes in this lecture, or more accessible level, enriching our vision of reality, theology, and natural science and dialogue. But I want in a moment to wrap do this for two reasons. The main one is that I want to give plenty of time for questions. The other is I have a slight time pressure myself. But I'm going to end, if I may, by quoting from somebody with whom I disagree on one or two things. And this is a quote from Dawkins' well-known book, which I think is very good, on Weaving the Wind. And I think it's the best line in that book. He's really trying to say, look, there's science and there's poetry. They don't really get on very well. And then he explains why he thinks that's the case. He has some possible remedies for it, which largely involves suppression of poetry. But towards the end of the book, he says this, and I like this very much. Keats and the Newton, listening to each other, might hear the galaxies sing. It's an unusually vivid visual image for Dawkins. I think it's all the richer for that. I think we can easily see how there's a thought there which could very easily be extended to not simply Keats and Newton, but the theologians and the scientists talking to each other might hear the heavens declaring the glory of God. I'll end there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you very much indeed.